So the Memphis Grizzlies have been put into a pretty rough situation with everything going down with John Morant and the news surrounding around him recently. And now just recently, Brandon Clark went down with the season-ending injury. So this team, they definitely have the potential to become a contender in the West. I mean, they're one of the best teams in the West, standing at the second seed with a record of 38-24. I think this team is definitely well constructed with every piece they have. And, when fully healthy, this team is definitely going to be one of the more competitive teams in the West. But, I mean, with a lot of injuries, a lot of, John Moran news recently, and a lot of just overall just underperforming performances from some of their players, it's definitely going to be difficult for this team to overachieve if everything doesn't go to plan. So in today's video, we're going to break down the team and where they can go from here, because outside of John Morant, I mean, the Grizzlies still have a solid team that is decently rounded out. So we'll get into it first. So I wanted to talk about John Morant first, since he's really the reason why I wanted to make this video, but also the news surrounding him recently. I mean, he was just recently suspended for 2 games because he held out a gun on his IG Live, and with that and him being one of the more bigger names in the NBA, he's been suspended for 2 games. And even before that, he was involved in news with pointing a gun at a 17-year-old. So I won't really go heavily into the news about John Morant, but for a player like him, I mean, to be involved in something like that, and especially since he's one of the more cockier players in the league, it's definitely not a good showing for his image and overall to his fans. So he's still a great player and one of the top point guards in the league. I will admit that he still is a top point guard in the league, but his off-court actions are just as strong as his on-court actions, and I think that's really important for a player, is to keep everything off the court clean and just be a good guy off the court. I mean, if you're involved in something like that off the court and being not being a nice guy essentially, or not being just a good figure for other people, then I think it's gonna definitely hurt your reputation in the NBA. So hopefully Ja can turn a new leaf soon. I mean, he still is very young at 23 years old. He has all the potential in the world, has a very high ceiling to become, I would say the best point guard in the league. Whenever Steph Curry retires, or even he might even pass Luka. We'll see what happens, but he definitely has the potential, the skill, and the talent to become one of the best point guards in the league. So we'll get into some positives about the Memphis Grizzlies here. So Jaren Jackson Jr. and Desmond Bane both have been pretty amazing for this team this season, and they've been playing their parts to the fullest. Jaren Jackson Jr. being a top defending forward in the league, and Desmond Bane being a knockdown three-point shooter who can also do mostly everything on the court that you really need him to. Kind of just a guy that can do everything on the court and just basically be out there making some threes, play some defense, and just get him out of there. So yeah, both those guys being on the team are definitely some huge positives. I mean, the thing I like about the Grizzlies is how they're developing their young pieces. Jaren Jackson Jr., I mean, in his first year, I want to say, wasn't really too great. I mean, I believe he was the fourth. Yeah, he was the 4th overall pick in 2018. It wasn't really too great. Definitely getting into the later parts of his career, definitely built a name for himself being a good defensive center, or a good power forward, good defensive power forward. So yeah, him being able to develop his defensive game is great. But also guys like Desmond Bane, I mean, I remember a couple seasons back, he wasn't really the best three-point shooter. Yeah, I think he was one of the worst three-point shooters back in his rookie year. You're looking at it right now in this season, he's one of the best three-point shooters, which is great. So the Memphis Grizzlies coaching staff and overall organization, I would say in terms of developing their pieces, I think they're definitely one of the best organizations for that. So yeah, and even on their coach for Taylor Jenkins, he's definitely one of the best coaches in the league too. So got to give props to him. But also, I mean, the Memphis Grizzlies, they have a lot of good pieces on their roster that can definitely help them win right now. So looking at the roster, guys like Dillon Brooks. I'll get into Dillon Brooks a little bit later on, kind of just talking about him, but he's also a pretty important piece to this roster. Brandon Clark, going down with injuries, unfortunate, but he still is a pretty big part to this roster. Acquiring Luke Kennard, I wouldn't say Luke Kennard's been great for this team, but his skill set and what he's able to do, he definitely provides some good three-point shooting for this team and just good spot-up shooting. So I think he might be a pretty good piece for them in the future. Maybe he might be a tradable asset. We'll see what happens, but guys like Xavier Tillman being a good backup option at the center position when Steven Adams was out. Zaire Williams being their sophomore player from last year's draft, so he has a lot of potential too. But yeah, I mean, this team is definitely well-rounded. Tyus Jones, also a good player. Santi Aldama, pretty good player too. So they have a lot of good young pieces. I mean, I'm not really seeing any player on here over 30 years old. The only guy closest to that is Steven Adams. So they have a good mix of vets, a good mix of young players, a good mix of some middle-aged players. So that's great to see. the Memphis Grizzlies, they do have a good mix of players that can also trade in the offseason. I think they could make a splash in the offseason if everything doesn't go according to plan. They are just a few pieces away. I think they definitely, I don't know what they really need for this team. Not really a point guard or a shooting guard, not even a power forward, maybe a solid small forward, I want to say. Maybe, I mean, they also have Dylan Brooks at the small forward, so maybe a center. I mean, Steven Adams, he's been okay for them as a, role-playing back or a role-playing center for them at the starting position, but I mean, 8.5 points and 12 rebounds is good. I don't know. He's definitely good for them. I would say maybe a defensive center. I don't know. It's definitely hard to see because they have a really good, well-rounded roster. The problem is they're just not performing well. So maybe touch up the bench a little bit, and that's probably where you're going to go on from there. Yeah, the Grizzlies, they still have a lot of potential in their roster, and I think maybe down the line when this team is fully developed, when they get some more pieces off the bench, I think they're definitely going to be more better off than they are right now. So finally, I want to talk about the team as a whole. Like I said, they constructed a very well-rounded roster, and when healthy, this team is definitely one of the best rosters out in the league and definitely one of the more competitive teams out there. And I think, when Steven Adams comes back, when Brandon Clark comes back next season, I think this team is definitely going to be one of the more I would say they're still going to be a top 5 team in the West, maybe even the best team in the West if they do add in some more pieces. And I just think that the Grizzlies, they just have a lot of potential. They do. As long as they have John Morant, as long as they have Jaren Jackson Jr., Desmond Bane, and Dylan Brooks, that core right there is definitely going to be what they want to build around in the future. Just bring in some more vets, and I think this team's going to be better off in the future. Also, like I said, I mean, adding in Dylan Brooks, I know he's built a reputation for himself of being a pretty annoying player on the court and even off the court. Kind of just making some statements about Draymond last night or even a couple days before. He still is a really important piece to this roster, bringing some good perimeter defense, but also being a pretty streaky shooter. I mean, he's definitely not the best shooter. His numbers are definitely down from last season. I mean, if you look at his season averages, 15 points per game or 14 points per game, 3 rebounds and around 3 assists. I mean, 39% from the field and 32% from 3 isn't all that great, but he still provides some great perimeter defense and even interior defense. So you got to give slack to Dylan Brooks. I think he's going to turn it around pretty soon. He is only 27 years old too, so he's not in his prime yet, but I feel like he's going to be approaching that pretty soon here. So yeah, other than that, this team is definitely well-rounded. Hopefully they can make some more moves in the offseason. The thing about the Grizzlies is that they sort of built a reputation for themselves to be a really cocky team, but when it comes to performing on court, they definitely underperform. We saw that last season against the Timberwolves where they lost in the second round, I want to say. So this team is still pretty fun to watch, and I will admit they honestly have a shot at the finals if everything goes to plan. The problem is that, as of right now, nothing is really going to plan, with the John Morant thing and the Brandon Clark thing, Dylan Brooks and his news. And, honestly, I just think that they need to just keep it together. They really do need to keep it together. Specifically, John Morant needs to keep his act together. And I think this team is going to be one of the more explosive teams in the West. So we'll see what happens with them. Hopefully they can at least make some noise in the next couple of games here. We have I would say around 20 to 15 games left of the season, around there. So hopefully they can make some more noise in the playoffs. I think they're going to be one of the more underrated teams in the playoffs, a team that really other teams only want to verse in the playoffs. I think they're going to be a team like that essentially. So that's the end of the video.